Welcome. Thanks for coming this morning. I got to tell you, the context for what you're getting happened over 3 days. So I'm only picking a piece of some of this. So some of the slides and things that we go to, we're going to fire through kind of quick. But I'll get to the meat of what was presented or what they wanted to hear. And again, this was a context with my brother, who is a missionary pastor in Slovenia, which is a country in the old Yugoslavia. And we got to do one weekend in Austria and the other weekend in Slovenia. So that's where these pictures are coming from. These were in Maribor, Slovenia, and this was up in, well, that was also in Slovenia. I don't have a photo from our time in Graz, Austria, which is the capital city of Austria. So my brother had asked me at least a couple years earlier, saying, would you come over and do some training on relational ministry? The folks that I get to be with are very program focused, and I would like to be able to teach and equip folks on how to do the relational approach to ministry, not only just youth ministry, but also pastors. And he said, we will connect with various youth ministry leaders and try to put a conference together. We had originally had decided to do this a year ago, but one of the persons in charge of one of the area youth ministries, which is a very prominent person, had gotten an invitation to go to Australia to do some things over the summer. So we postponed this a year. So this past summer it became, so it took a 2-year process to make that happen. And it was when I arrived, good morning. When I arrived, we met with the leaders to talk a little bit about how they wanted the conference to go. And this was really an historical event because it's the first time these youth ministries gathered together with their staff and their volunteers to do some youth ministry training together. And the event went over extremely well. I sent over a bunch of material that I use in my Relational Ministries course. One was, I did some PowerPoint stuff on the book of Mark. Much of what we do in the class comes out of the Gospel of Mark. And also a book that is entitled Shaping the Spiritual Lives of Students. And along with that, I have that book. It's in my backpack at home, unfortunately. And then the other book is called Revisiting Relational Ministry by Andrew Root. But much of that material was all put into a brochure, or I should say a booklet. And so these PowerPoints are in here, and they're all in Slovenian. And so it's kind of funny to see this in different languages, my pictures and all that content coming out in that. So, what happened is they had 70 of these printed up, thinking between the 2 weekends, actually this was really mainly for the second weekend, that would be enough. But we got in within the first couple of hours of presenting, and all these were gone. And so they didn't have enough throughout the course of the weekend, and so they printed up 100 more after I left and started distributing those within the context of the various ministries that my brother was working with and these other leaders were working with. So that's kind of the context of what I got to do last summer. I spent 2 weeks in Slovenia staying with my brother's family and getting to know his boys and then presenting this material on a couple of different weekends. So again, the topic having to do with contact ministry, and this is a phrase that comes from my experience in being equipped and trained with Young Life. Youth for Christ uses this very similar model, and it's this idea of going. And so it's an intentional effort to enter into the adolescent culture. And this is where the incarnational witness approach kind of comes from. It's really modeling after what Jesus did in the incarnation, that the Word becomes flesh and dwells among us. The way that Eugene Peterson says this, he says, the Word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood. And it's the idea that we engage with folks in their world. It's not about people coming to our deals. It's about us entering into their world. And so that's where the incarnation comes. And it's not that we are replicating the incarnation, because we can't do that. Only Jesus did that. But we are a witness to that incarnation when we enter into that world. That's a large part of what Andrew Root writes about in Revisiting Relational Ministries. It's because much of the criticism came as this relational approach was seen as just that, a method, an approach that Jesus used, as opposed to a lifestyle. This is how life is meant to be done. And it's not somehow a magical approach that we use. And so when we talk about the incarnational witness, that's kind of an added into word. It really comes from one of my first seminary classes. The Incarnational Witness class that I had when I first started with Young Life, when I just graduated college and started working with Young Life, and was required to go take seminary courses, and that was part of that training. It was one of my first courses. Made a huge impact on me because of understanding what it meant to enter into people's worlds and understand them in their environment, and to minister to them in their environment. So it takes a lot of effort on our part to enter into that, as opposed to trying to get folks to come to our things. And so there was a lot of things, and this is the stuff that I'm going to kind of just fire through as we go. You'll notice, anybody recognize who that is? Chuck Norris, I found out through my brother and his kids that he is like the major icon in Slovenia. It says in his hope would be to try to get Chuck Norris to come to Slovenia to put on some conferences. That's a big part of what my brother has done over the years, is put on some major events, both for revival aspects and but also constant continual ministry to folks, because he's there, he's living among them. But he thought Chuck would be a great draw to kind of share the gospel. And Chuck is a committed Christian believer, and they're still working at trying to get him to come in the future. But nevertheless, I threw him in his picture in a few slides. But again, some of that we recognize. What I thought I was going there to do was to present the scriptural basis for why we do relational ministry. And after they got my material from the outlines of things that I teach within the context of our relational ministries course, he says, I don't want you to spend time in the Word. I want you to go through the nuts and bolts of how you go about doing this. We get that. All these folks who are coming are believers. They're very grounded in the Word. And so you can do a little bit of just touching on how the Word helps to encourage us to move in that direction. But I want you to spend more time in the nuts and bolts of the stuff that your slides and presentations that you do within the class. So that was a little bit of a switch on me after I sent them all the material, thinking that that's what I was going to be doing. It was unpacking theologically. So because I sent him a big part of the Gospel of Mark, highlighting a lot of the things that we would talk about that draw some of these principles of incarnational ministry out of the Gospel of Mark. And so if you want to, and this is one of the things that we do within our relational classes, we do an expository walking through, an exegetical work of walking through the Gospel of Mark, and just pulling out the content for which Jesus demonstrates within the context of his doing life with folks, about how that helps us to direct us to do life as well. And so, again, some of this theological aspect comes out of the Gospel of Mark, but also we see right in Genesis that God is a relational being in his creation. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, let us make man in our own image. And so, again, because of that, God himself is a relational being and desires for us to be in relationship with him first and foremost, and with each other secondly. We look through Genesis, and all through the book of Genesis, you get the transition of folks moving from being in a close relationship with God to deviating from his plans, and the need, once we get to Genesis 12, where Abraham is now established to be blessed, to be a blessing. He is to be the father of many nations. And in that, he says to give to his creation those with whom he's going to build as his nation for the sake of others. It's not for his benefit, but rather for the benefit of others. And so we get that through the New Testament as well. We get the disciples are trained in that, as well as the apostles. And the apostles experience great growth within the church because of how they are bringing their message of what Christ did in the resurrection to the people, to the nations, even through the book of Acts. Again, another great, to read through the Gospels and read through the book of Acts, you see the explosion of how the disciples were sent, even through the scatter, so to speak, of others coming to know who Christ is, and they modeled that as they began to minister in different parts of the country. So, getting to this concept is some of the biblical concepts that we breezed through or breezed over, and so. But I stopped here and highlighted some of these things. First of all, from Mark 2:17, Jesus made it very clear it was not the healthy who needed the doctor, but the sick. And so his intent was not for the nation of Israel, but to reach the lost, those that didn't know God. And that's why there was tension with the Jews at times, because they felt that the Messiah was going to come from them, for them. But really this Messiah comes, yes, for them, but also for all of his creation and for the Gentiles. And so Jesus demonstrating that as he reaches out to the needy, to the hurting, to the broken. And it really messed with the minds of the Pharisees and the religious leaders of those times. And it will even today. When you think about who we're called to go to, is the broken, the hurting, the lost, of which Jesus demonstrated very clearly as he walked the earth. And so in Luke 15, he's accused of being a sinner because he hung out with sinners and tax collectors. And so again, he was willing to run the risk of those accusations to reach those who needed to be in a relationship with him. And in Mark 10:45, he says, "I did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give my life as a ransom for many." So his intent was clearly to demonstrate his leadership, his lordship through, his service to others. And in that service, he demonstrates a leadership capacity that we are still trying to equip others to do so. Because leadership is not a top-down kind of thing, but rather a bottom-up. And the way that Jesus does that is through service, and serving and caring for others around him. And we can only do that in relationship with folks. And so clearly, as we come to some of Paul's writings that support this as well, in 1 Thessalonians 2:8 is kind of the verse that we build our youth ministry program on. And where Paul says, "For we love you so much that we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well, because you have become so dear to us." And now that's become my life verse. Early on in my training with Young Life, through that incarnational witness class, I adopted that kind of as the way that I wanted to approach doing life and ministry with folks. I wanted to share the gospel, but I also wanted to share life with folks. And so through my years of serving with folks in Chicago and in Grand Rapids and at Fifth Reformed Church and now here at Kuiper, is about doing life with each other. I still play a role in the high schools in terms of my training with coaching a couple of high school sports. And again, we do life together. We have a team dinner happening next week right before our regionals. So it's not just about the events, it's about doing life together. With our small group, with folks that have ebbed and flowed in terms of the things that they've experienced in life, that we are with each other through the mess and the mire that we experience. Some of the pain, the struggles, but also some of the great joys that we get to celebrate with one another. Adoptions, marriages, all those things that happen as we continue to journey through life. We're intended to do life together. And in the Corinthian passages there that talks about, we don't speak of our own eloquence, but really we preach Christ and Him crucified. And be in that relationship with Him. And to build that relationship over a course of time and the context of doing life's experiences. So from that, we get a couple of statements that I think support this idea of contact ministry. One is C.T. Studd, who's a missionary. He said, "Some men want to sit within the sound of a church or a church bell or a chapel bell. Not I." He says, "I want to set up a rescue shop within a yard of hell." So where does he have to be in that? You've got to be out in the world, engaging folks in the stuff that they're going through. And yes, it's messy. That's not neat and clean. It's not a retreat from the world, but it's an engagement with. And that is not easy to do. In a sense, for some of us, it's very risky because of our own susceptibilities to certain sins that are out there. So we need a community of folks that are doing this with us to help hold us accountable in the things that we're doing. But we set up that shop in the context of where people are doing life. And again, that's going to be confusing in some regards to the church. And to folks who feel like we're supposed to be religious and clean and not get messy with that and want to retreat from some of the world. And granted, for training purposes, I get that. And I often say within my class, the whole idea of a monastery and monkdom, I don't see that as what Jesus planned was. Now, if it's for training purposes, to be sent out eventually, then yes, I get that. Fine, welcome. But again, if it's the way we're going to spend to do life, I don't think that's what Jesus intended for us to do. Contact ministry is about doing ministry the way God did. Jesus did not set up a shop in the church, but he went to where the people were. It's a going ministry of presence. That's a phrase I try to teach our students to really memorize, to recognize that I'm supposed to be going, and it's about being present in their world. And it means a high level of visibility. It means being available. And the only way you can be available is by being present. You have to engage with folks. You have to be in their world to do something. Now, one of the challenges as we came into this context within Slovenia is they don't do life the way that we do here in Western America, Western civilization. It's a very different approach. And so let me explain that in a second. And some of the approaches that we're most accustomed to is the informational approach. We feel like in many of our churches that we just give them a lot of content. And much of my journey in coming to Fifth Reformed Church in the early days was they just wanted the Heidelberg Catechism taught. Boy, if we just taught them the Heidelberg Catechism, they would come out fine. And says they could go, well, how many of you had that experience? And not all of us have come out fine from that experience. Granted, the content is good. I don't dispute that in any way. But really, that content was meant for believers, for folks who are a later stage in life. And it says what we have to do is not about information, but about showing and modeling folks who Jesus is and his desire for them to be in a relationship with him. So the informational approach is not one that really works that well for our systems. Then there's the impositional approach. There's a little example there with Chuck Norris firing on there. But it's, the impositional approach is that you just do it. You do it my way because I said so. And again, as we know, adolescents, they're not going to respond very well to that. They need to know the reasons why. Why do we do certain things that we do? And so just to force folks to do so, God didn't take that approach. I mean, Jesus could have come not within the birth through a virgin. He could have come out of the clouds. That God could have come like our picture of Zeus in that sense, and commanding and demanding, and people would have been fearful in that experience. Well, he didn't choose to do so. He came through life the way we do, and entered life as we do, to experience life as we do. And in so, he models the way that we are to care for and love one another. That could have been an inspirational approach where he came into this whole wow factor and people were amazed. And he does some of that in the context of his miracles. But even then, people struggled with still following him in the midst of that. And even seeing all the wow stuff that we try to do sometimes in youth ministry doesn't necessarily work for the long haul. It's hard to compete with what Hollywood kind of creates in terms of responding to whatever benefit they try to communicate in the context of the movies and shows. But rather, we need to take the incarnational witness approach. And again, this is something that Jesus describes and lives out in experiences. The Word becomes flesh and dwells among us. It's simple, yet profound. When you think about the Word becoming flesh and dwelling among us, I guess that's not so simple, because only Jesus does this. But yet, he becomes available, and he's approachable. He doesn't have this crowd around him in the sense that people can't get to him. In fact, when even children are going, the disciples are really, what's the word? It's an R. They are reprimanded. There we go. They were reprimanded for hindering the children from coming to him. And he says, no, I am here for all, to be approachable, to be available. The only way that happens is if he's in with the people. And the experiences that he has with children, with the different people who are experiencing pain. I think about the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years and felt all I need to do is touch his clothes. And that's what she does. She reaches in the midst of a crowd. People are touching and pushing him all over the place. But she touches him in a very unique way, with faith that enables healing to take place like nothing else. Now, to get an audience with him, if he was hanging out in synagogues with all kinds of layers of people around him, that wasn't going to happen. But because he was available, because he was present with us, she experienced incredible healing. He didn't avoid the world, he entered it. He went in where he could have stayed. He watched, examined, rejected, followed, loved, and he was hated. And recognized we're going to experience that same thing, because the world's not going to understand us as we move into people's worlds just like he did. We should not expect anything less than what he expected or what he experienced. Granted, I hope none of us are crucified, but we do recognize it does happen maybe in a verbal sense about the way that we live out our faith. So what are some of the techniques, so to speak, that we can get into? And this became what the meat, so to speak, of what my brother and the ministries folks wanted to spend more time on. How do we do this? Because in Slovenia is very different than a way school is done here in the United States. We talk a lot about, in our context, to be able to enter into the environment where most of our adolescents spend most of their time. If you have a way to gain access into the school, you have an opportunity to be a part of the fabric of their lives in a very unique way. And so that's why I advocate being a coach, looking for a way to be a tutor, looking for ways that you can serve in the school setting so that you're a part of the fabric, part of being the presence, being available in their world, and not just somebody they see at church on Sunday or Wednesdays, or whatever night the gathering might be happening. But that we enter into the environment for their lives. Well, in Slovenia, there is a very clear divide between the school systems and the way life is happening. They don't enter into that environment. Principals are really the kings, so to speak, or queens, or commanders of that environment. That is still the case here, but we're receptive to a little bit more of other adult help with that. That has not been the case in Slovenia. And even the students, there is not this kind of relational rapport that we have with one another. Some of you know my niece, Sarah, who was here the last 2 years. Sarah found it very challenging coming into this environment and having a relationship with her professors. It was anti everything that she experienced in her high school journey. Because again, you know, sometimes as kindergartens, you see your teacher at the grocery store and don't know what to do with that, because they're not real people. They're teachers. They don't shop and they don't do things that we all do. And so it's kind of like that in their world. They don't cross those boundaries. We, though, have a much more, at least in my context, in our context in youth ministry, we recognize the value of what relationships are in the teacher-learner experience. Well, for them, it's much more autocratic. It's hierarchical in that sense. So to enter into that environment is a whole new way of thinking on how to do this. My brother shared a story of a couple who came to Slovenia. My brother happens to, again, having been there now for almost 25 years, he's kind of become the gatekeeper for missionaries who want to come into Slovenia. In Slovenia, if you want to come in and have residence in this role, you have to have a sponsor. And my brother has become that sponsor for many missionaries who have come into their context. And so to do that, he has got to be known around the country on a number of different levels. And so there was a couple who wanted to come in, and he sponsored them to come in, and have built a great relationship with them. Well, after years, they were moving from the town that he was from, which is Ljubljana, as the capital city, to Maribor, which is where the conference was done. And they wanted to engage the school. They get that we want to enter into that world. Well, how can we do that? Well, they had an experience in Ljubljana where they were able to create these English conversational clubs. And in Slovenia, that was a high value, to be able to speak English. Again, most of the folks in other countries are multilingual. And so my brother's wife speaks 5 languages. And she's fluent in all of them. And so it just is astounding, but that's the way she just did life. And so it's English, it's Slovene, it's Croatian, it's Bosnian, and so in German is the other. My brother also speaks German and Slovenian. And so it's because of the world that they live in. So to be able to communicate in the different languages allows them to be of service to folks. Well, English, again, becomes kind of the gateway to better jobs, to a better life experience and whatnot. And so for somebody to come and offer English classes, it would be a high value. And so this couple wanted to offer this to the school that they were moving to in Maribor. And they knew that my brother knew the principal there. And again, some of the things that we talked about in that class is if you can gain access to the principal through someone that principal knows and respects, you're in a whole lot quicker than if you try to do that cold turkey. And so he was more than pleased to drive the 2 hours away up to Maribor and set up a meeting with this principal. And this couple, who was, I think they were in their 30s at this point, had some kids, and said, we would like to offer a volunteer English clubs for students to learn English on their own. And my brother telling the story says, you should have seen her face. She stopped in her tracks. You could just feel her body just kind of relax. She said, I could offer you 5 hours a day and pay you for that if you're willing to do that. So they were looking to volunteer. They just wanted to be able to have access into the schools and be able to teach folks English. But the value that they had within this, she could pay somebody. She says, that's a great avenue to gain access into the school setting. In their world, they had to be creative about how to do that. And so as we started unpacking some of these principles, we started thinking a little bit about what does that look like? How are we going to go about doing that? I said that no, that's one great way to get creative about how to do that. Athletics is another way. They do not have sports like we have sports here. All their athletics are separate from the school. They're clubs. They're different types of organizations that do that outside the school setting, so they aren't associated with the school at all. So the ways that we do some of the things that we talk about to be incarnational and entering into those worlds, into schools, or maybe help coach a team or whatnot, that's not connected with the school. It's connected to something else. It's still a great way, bless you, to do the same thing and make that happen. So some of the principles we talked about is winning the right to be heard. Students would rather know that you care before they care what you know. Now that's a little bit of a cliche that we might be saying a lot, but look at what that says. It says it is not about simply sharing the gospel, as we talked about. I want to sharing the love of God without doing it in the relational context. You have to do it in a both and, as Paul described. And so again, students need to know that you care before they care at all about what you have to share with them. So you can't go in with some kind of an agenda that I want folks to come to know Christ, and I'm hoping we're going to check those off as we go. It's more about building a relationship with them and earning or winning the right to be heard. And that, folks, takes time. It takes a lot of time and effort. That's why in youth ministry and in some circles where people gain a job perhaps, or a role, an internship at a church for a year and a half while they're going to seminary and whatnot, it just doesn't work that way. I think it's a no-win situation when we give those positions over to somebody who's only going to be there for a year and a half. What we try to teach here is a theology of place, and I try to communicate that. What these folks have demonstrated, the folks I was speaking to, have been here for years, and I gave a great accolade to my brother who had said, I am here. This is home for me. My mom used to ask him, when are you coming home? And I told my mom, I said, Mom, he is home. He's coming back for a visit. That's his home. That's where he's investing his life in the world. And because of that, he's gained tremendous credibility for that, because he stayed when he could have gone. They really feel called to minister to that, folks. And so he has won the right to be heard with a lot of folks because of the time that he's put in terms of building those relationships. Another reality of time is we're building bridges. And the last thing you want somebody to do is build a bridge in a quick way, because it won't sustain. We've seen even ones that are starting to get repaired, and sometimes you got to use this visual of a bridge, and you recognize that's essentially what we are doing. We are bridging folks from their own world and selfishness to a bridge of understanding who Christ and a life of service and gifts that he offers us. But we know that bridge was created through the cross, and some folks use that as an evangelistic tool. But we also recognize one of the realities of building a bridge is it takes time, and it takes a lot of effort. It's not going to be done in a hurry. If anybody's been up to Mackinac Bridge or been down to the Keys and seen the 7 Mile Bridge, I'm just blown away by the engineering feat to be able to have those be sustained. Especially as now we got a hurricane coming through Florida. Hopefully it's going to turn north and not hit the East Coast here. But you see those, how in the world is that sustained? It's because they went through the right process in order to establish a foundation that will last through the difficulties. And so we have to recognize if we're taking an incarnational approach, it means we're going to be there for the long haul. Much of Scripture, what we get in the Gospels of Jesus' public ministry, has happened in maybe a context of 3 years. But you got to know, much of what has been established in those 3 years happened in the 28 years prior to that, whatever, approximately the stage of life that Jesus was when he was teaching. But then the disciples for years began to continue that whole vision on in terms of building those bridges and making those connections as time went on. We identify where people are at. And he says it's part of that living into their world is being able to see life from their perspective, to engage with them in their world, so that they understand that we understand what they go through. And to be preaching or teaching from above and downward, there's not that connection. But by living amongst, by walking in and experiencing life as they experience, there's a sense of connectedness that happens like nothing else. We accept us where we are, Jesus does, but he loves us too much to leave us there. So again, we accept people where they are, but we help to build and move them on to not stay in that state. but to move in something greater and to be able to experience His blessings in the way that God intended, as He did with Abraham, blessed to be a blessing. Understanding and penetrating a culture. What we do is we are making what is unknown I will proclaim. What Paul says in this idea is that when he comes and visits Athens, and he said that all these monuments, all these sculptures and things to various gods that exist, and there was one to the unknown God, and he says, I come here to proclaim what is unknown, to make Him known. And that's essentially what we do in the incarnational witness approach, is to be an authentic example of a Jesus follower. Okay? An authentic example of a Jesus follower. It doesn't mean we're perfect, but it means that we're doing life with folks, wrestling through life's issues, and journeying with folks in the midst of the things that they're going through. Demonstrating Christ's love for people. As Jesus said to His disciples, that they will know that you are my disciples by all the knowledge you have and the way you display that to others. No, He didn't say that. He said they will know that you are my disciples by your love for one another. And so we have a great capacity to demonstrate that. By our love for each other draws folks into that community. So again, as we build leadership teams, as we create arenas for folks to work with adolescents or others, regardless, it doesn't have to necessarily be adolescents. I think these principles really hold true for even senior pastors, associate pastors, bank presidents, people in high positions as well in commerce and whatnot. If you demonstrate these principles in this arena, you will experience God's blessings in all that you do. Because we don't just do it for our own benefit, we do it for the benefit of the community. A few other things about it. Contact ministry is this whole role of active listening. And one of the things that we talked about was about learning one another's names. And you should have seen the looks on their faces. They all went, oh, I'm just terrible at that. I can't do that. And again, God has given a blessing to me in terms of being able to memorize easily. And so through the course of this weekend, I had met, again, tens of 100 people. I guess there was 120 people at this weekend retreat. I knew a lot of them by name. And it was fun to be able to do that when somebody called their name and say, to call them by name to respond to that. And so we talk a lot about, in our relational ministries class, about working at knowing one another's names. Jesus made it clear when he called on folks that He knows every hair upon our head and knows all the details of our lives. Well, we can do just a little bit of that just by remembering people's names. And by doing so you communicate great value in doing so. So that means being active in your listening. And we go through a bunch of techniques about how to remember names and everything by introducing yourself, by repeating their name, by writing them down. And so I encourage folks to be able to work at remembering people's names. Because there's something about meeting somebody for the first time and then being able to call them by name the second time you see them. And there's a great value because you remembered my name. So practice that. Granted, some of us have the gift of it. Others of us need to work at it. So I encourage you to take the opportunity to work at it. And so if you go up to a school, if you go to a place where you're trying to establish ministry, make lists. One of the things I'm impressed by my wife, who's a middle school counselor, is that every other year she gets a whole new group. They loop with their team. So if you're in 7th grade one year, you're going to be the 8th grade counselor the next year. Well, you know a large part of your group by the time that second year comes going in the 8th grade. But now is the time to loop back to the new incoming 7th graders. My wife gets the 6th grade yearbook and spends the summer looking at those faces and getting familiar with the names. Now, granted, they change a bit at that stage of life. Not just a bit, a lot of it in that. So, but by seeing those names and by looking at those pictures, she works in the off season to be able to know folks when they walk through the door. Can you imagine for a 7th grader walking into a middle school and being called by name by your middle school counselor? I'm so impressed by that. She gets it. She knows what that's like. And communicates that value for folks in terms of doing life. And we can do the same thing. And I believe Jesus does that same thing, the way He cares for us in the things that we do. We talk about different levels of contact ministry. One, just kind of being present, being seen. The second is having a conversation. And the third is doing activities together. And so part of that seminar was encouraging folks to come up with ways that they could do that. And so we spent much more time kind of trying to unpack that through the course of the weekend. So you got 35 minutes of some of the stuff that took place over that couple of weekends, and meeting with folks during the week too. It was a lot of fun to begin to unpack some of that with folks. So.
All right, so we have about 5 minutes left for question and answer. Does anybody not have an evaluation? If you guys have questions, you can ask them now. And fill out the evaluation and hand it to me when you leave.
How many folks have had the relational ministries class? Okay. The rest of you are welcome next semester. How many of you say you're good at memorizing and knowing names? Okay, there's 5 of us. Okay? The rest of us, I encourage you to work at it. And I would encourage you to work at it even around here. Many of you know I make that very intentional in my intro to admin class. So again, working at those names. Be able to call each other by name walking through the hallways. Down at lunch. If you don't know somebody's name, ask them. Communicate that value as you have an opportunity to do life with each other. And so don't just put that off, but be intentional about getting to know folks. And again, if you need to, keep a notebook of it. Or put them on your phone. You know, use your phone for them. You can be kind of creepy by going like this and taking a picture. And then going in and writing the name. But, be careful of doing that. Don't go in that. No questions? All right. Well, thanks for coming. You are free to go. And on to the next session. It starts at 9:50, I believe. Yes?
Yes.
All right.
Hand me your evaluation.